I'm excited for our chat, and I love the new book, The Art of Impossible. I can tell you put everything into this. Your first encounter with the impossible was all the way back at 9 years old. You share a story in the book with your brother, who's 7 at the time, and he comes out and shows you a magic trick that just blew your mind. So take us back there and talk about that experience.
Yeah, it was impossible is such a funny term, right? It means that which we believe, will never be done. But the first time I ever like saw something, right? I've seen in the years since I've seen lots of things that they look like magic tricks, but this was the first time I actually saw a magic trick. My baby brother comes home from a friend's house with a sponge ball, makes it vanish. And all of a sudden, all I knew is two things. Like, first of all, mom was paying a lot of attention to my baby brother, and I don't know if that was entirely cool with my 9-year-old self. And two, I was like, holy crap, whatever that was, it literally looked like the impossible. It didn't make any sense to me. And in my 9-year-old brain, my logic was, well, wait a minute, if my brother's not magic, which I didn't think he was, there's got to be a skill set underneath this thing that looks like it's impossible. There's actually got to be a skill. And in 11 years old, it led me into professional magic, which I did for about 10 years as a sort of way to make a living. Started working when I was really young. But and lessons sort of continued in magic because it is actually an art of fooling people in the impossible stuff that look right. So it's the same sort of lesson over and over again, which may have made me believe the impossible is more possible than most people might have come into the world believing.
And to this day, are you still into magic?
I am still into magic. I have lots of friends who are magicians, and there's a whole aspect of neuroscience that is based around why magic works, like why the brain gets fooled. A lot of neuroscience over the years has been propelled forward by things like optical illusions. And why do optical illusions fool us? And that has led us to a lot of insights around the visual system. And people about 10 years ago started to have the same insight around magic. So there's actually a whole sort of movement in the world of magic. There's a crossover between magic and neuroscience. So kind of old passion meets new passion for me.
And for you, when was the beginning of your writing? When did you develop that passion?
Oh, that was older. I wrote my first poem when I was 4. I sort of always wanted to be a writer. Since for as long as I can remember, I was writing. I think I've been writing every day since I was probably 15 or 16.
And what was it about writing? Was it at 4 you got some attention from your parents after writing this poem, or what was it about it that captivated you?
My mom had me. My parents were pretty young when I was born. We didn't have a ton of money, and my mom really didn't know, like, how do you raise a kid? And my father had taken a job. We grew up, I was born in Chicago, and my father quickly took a job in Cleveland. And so, like, there was no support network around. My mom was like, how the hell do I raise a son? And she didn't know what the right answer was, but she knew that books were good. So all she did is she would go to the library, we'd take out stacks of 100 books, and she would read to me all the time. So I really think it started there. But I think most writers have this experience. I don't think this is just kin to me, but I was a weird kid. I'm a weird adult. I was definitely a weird kid. And part of being a weird kid is you don't meet anybody who thinks like you, right? What you discover over and over and over, and maybe this is everybody being a teenager, but especially if you're a weirdo, wow, the world really doesn't think like me. I'm very different. And there were certain writers I stumbled upon where I was 14 or 15 or 16, E. Cummings, Samuel Beckett, a couple others, where I went, holy crap, they think exactly like me. There are people like me. They just do this thing with words, and this is how I know. So I think some of it was that also.
And what is it about you that was weird? You said you're still weird to this day, but like, what was it as a kid that made you not fit in?
I didn't understand power structures. I questioned authority very young. I didn't, I, because I said so was not an acceptable answer to me at age 5 for things like that. Um, I also, the same stuff that I built on in my career, I had a pretty good intuitive understanding, even as a kid, of sort of human emotion. I think anybody who grows up in difficult circumstances, sometimes you have to figure out other people very, very, very quickly. So I solved a bunch of those sorts of things early on, and then you start to see how people work, and that's just a totally different kind of weirdness. I don't know. I can't answer it. I mean, I was just a nerd, right? I was into dinosaurs and comic books and Dungeons and Dragons and martial arts, and I was just a classic nerd, and I knew very outrageous, wild people. And for whatever reason, Cleveland in the 1970s was such a weird, the whole city had burned to the ground. It was this giant, desolate, like you could get away with so much stuff, crazy stuff for years and years and years, because it was like this sort of abandoned city surrounded by these really strange suburbs. It was just a very odd place. And in the end, I fit in just fine, but it took a while to find my people there.
And do you think it was this weirdness that was innate within you that brought you into action sports and your interest there?
I was a skier from very early on, and I skateboard very early on, and I've always been very attracted to things that go fast, especially human-powered things that go fast, and I've also been very attracted to wild places. And for me, like, I so remember it was in college, it was after my freshman year, I was at the University of Wisconsin, and between my freshman and sophomore year, and I was looking for apartments, and we went to visit this apartment and we were going to rent the apartment from, it was occupied at that point, and the guy was an action sport athlete, and he had a closet filled with like climbing gear and all this stuff I had never seen before. And I just remember opening the closet and thinking, I don't even know what this is, but this is all for me, whatever this is, this, yes. And that was real where I started to realize, oh, there's this thing that I like, which is called action sports, and there are other people. I had been rock climbing a little bit in high school. I went skydiving. I convinced all my, but you have to understand, this was a time that nobody was doing these things. We had, when first went skydiving, I jumped from an old army round parachute from a static line where you had to step out on a little step and hold on to the wings of the plane at like 90, at 10,000 feet, and let go. It was a totally, it's not like it is now where people do this stuff. Even skiing was, weird. Ski bums, surf bums. You could be into it, but too into it. There was a line that said, "Hey, you're a failure." Now we don't think of that at all, right? How you want to have a great meeting about a film in LA? Go surf, right? Go surf at Malibu. That's what's going on in the waves now, but that wasn't then.
And what do you think this draw was that you had to adrenaline and the intensity of action sports and jumping out of airplanes? Like, where does that come from?
So it all comes from the same place, in all honesty. Like, um, I kept needing to prove me to me. I had a very hard time. It's interesting. Laird Hamilton and I, the big wave surfer, once had this discussion. This is in The Art of Impossible. And my oldest emotion, the thing that I have felt my whole life, is fear. It's the most common emotion in my life. And very early on, I discovered that most of what I want is on the other side of that. And I was afraid of everything, like everything you could possibly, and I was bad at everything. But I couldn't stand the feeling of being afraid. It was worse than doing the thing that was scaring me. The feeling of living with that was impossible for me. Laird talked about the same way. So very early on, I discovered that like I could find relief from that part of my psyche by going at the thing that scared me. And you do this enough times, you start to realize that, oh my God, everything I want, everything that's really amazing, what we call meaning or purpose or fulfillment, often on the other side of those fears. So these were very early like lessons in peak performance that we now understand why and how they work and all this stuff. And I think these are the same lessons that most people who end up, going on to um, sort of be able to pursue what they love in the world, or you know what I mean, develop a craft and start to master that. We all learn these lessons one way or another because it's just our biology that we're working with. So these are familiar lessons. I just happened to learn that one first, right, and sort of the hard way. But it unlocked a lot of stuff, and I was also good. I wasn't good at a lot of stuff. I was really good at action sports, or I thought I was really good at action sports. And then very early on in my career as a journalist, it was in the beginning, it was what led me into covering action sports. I was covering science and action sports because I could speak those languages and other journalists didn't. And so it was a little bit of a market advantage. You know what I mean? Like I could write stories that other people couldn't. So I was the guy they sent out to cover these stories. And I got lucky in that both like neuroscience and action sports in the early 1990s started catching everybody's attention. So there was tons of work for my particular weird ass skill set, right? And once I got into action sports, and because the 90s was this great era of action sports, I wrote about it in my book, Rise of Superman, more than the art of impossible, but more so-called impossible things never going to be done, never will be done, outside the realm of what a human being is capable of doing. These were falling on a weekly basis. And seeing it up close, was really insane because it wasn't like I was seeing it on a screen and, oh, there was an athlete on the screen who I could watch on television. He was doing something impossible. It was literally like I would go drinking with a guy on Friday night in the bar, and he's just another guy sitting next to me in the bar. And then Saturday morning, he goes out and does something that's never been done in the history of the world and is not supposed to be able to be done. And it's the guy you were drinking with the night before was the first, like, what the hell's going on here? And a lot of the journalists started talking about it and talking about how the level of performance kept going up and up. Nobody was saying, "Oh my God, we keep seeing the impossible happen over and over and over." But we would talk about, we'd get together like once a year at these annual events for sports writers, and people would say, "Yeah, I think we saw that we hit the ceiling this year. There's no way it can keep going. It's not humanly possible." And next year would be crazier and kept happening. And after a little while, you start going, "Well, why is this happening?" And B, I was writing about neuroscience and psychology, and I was interested in achievement and success and things along those lines. And one of the things that's really clear, if you know anything about the neuroscience of psychology and achievement, is the people I was seeing who were literally reinventing what was possible for our species. Most of the folks I knew had terrible childhoods. They came from broken homes. They had almost no education. They had very little money. There was a lot of booze. There was a lot of drugs. Like when you put those things together, usually what happens is people die young or go to jail. They don't reinvent what's possible for your species. That's right. So I was seeing all this up close all the time. At the same time, I was working on the neuroscience of how does this stuff happen in the brain. After a little while, you got to put the two together and go, wait a minute, there's a puzzle here. This is really weird. Is it just these action sport athletes? Is it just action sports, right? And that the desire to take that question out of action sports and then into other, areas into technology and science and, culture and business and all the places I've studied this question was sort of spurred by that, or like, because it didn't make sense. Like, they didn't strike me as that they were cool, interesting people. And a lot of them I have great friends in that community to this day, but I've got great friends in lots of communities. And I can't like tell you that the action sports, you know what I mean? They're not any more special or extraordinary or anything. They're very normal human beings who do extraordinary things all the time. And that begs an explanation, I think. It did for me.
Well, let's get a little bit deeper into that and talk about, like you said, a lot of times these people would come from troubled childhoods, and why are they not ending up on drugs or in jail? Instead, they're achieving these new levels, of the impossible. So, what is different about these people in action sports versus the people that take the other path?
Let me back up a couple steps into like some high level science about human peak performance and start there. So, peak performance and anything you might consider peak performance is nothing more than getting your biology to work for you rather than against you. There's no secret. There's just your biology. And because there's your biology, it's actually a limited suite of tools. There's four categories of skill sets that really matter and to humans, and it's motivation, which is a catch-all phrase, psychological catch-all phrase for internal motivation, external motivation, goals, and grit. Those all sort of fold under motivation. There's a whole bunch of stuff under learning. There's creativity, creative problem solving, and then there's flow. Flow is optimal performance. Everybody, every human being is hardwired to get into a state of flow. What we also know is that flow states have triggers, preconditions that lead to more flow. We can go into way more detail, but you asked about the action sport athletes and what was happening. So what started to happen for a variety of reasons in the 1990s, the action sport athletes started to prioritize basically in their lives all of flow's triggers. They basically built their lives and their cultures. And this was at the beginning of when like action sports towns like Squaw Valley or Jackson Hole or Whistler um, were sort of starting to emerge. And those are towns that, as their core values happen to be flows triggers. They started doing a lot of things that prioritize the state. When you couple that with the actual demands of action sport, because action sports is unlike other things where you can screw up in other places and the consequences are not fatal. In action sports, a lot of times, if you screw up in the backcountry, somebody can die or go to the hospital. So execution is a lot higher. So some of the other stuff, the motivation stuff, the grit stuff, the goal stuff, came baked in. So what ended up happening is these communities of practitioners started prioritizing flow, and they started developing all the other core support skills you need for peak performance. And it was sort of a cauldron. You sometimes see the same thing. I always say that what I'm describing right here with the action sport athletes is any innovation culture, right? Whether you're talking about San Francisco in the 60s, right? And the hippie revolution, those kinds of ideas, or grunge music in Seattle in the 90s, or Silicon Valley, another very high flow country. You're always seeing the same thing because there's only our biology and the skill. As I said, the toolkit is limited, but for a variety of reasons, the action sport athletes took the most advantage of it. And I could drill down one level if you want me to, that might make it a little more clear.
Sure.
Okay. So let me give you one example. Flow shows up. Flow, first of all, flow is a massive uptick in performance. Productivity and motivation go up some 500%, according to a study that was done by McKinsey. Self-reported, but meaning they went around the world actually asking CEOs, how much more productive do you feel in flow? And on average, after a 10-year study, it was 500%. So not a hard number, self-reported number, but still, Jesus, 500% is a huge boost. And it aligns with the Department of Defense, did a bunch of studies on flow and learning. We learn 240% faster in flow. Same thing, creativity is and innovation will go up 400 to 700% in flow. These are huge spikes. So the more flow you get, the more peak performance you get. And it goes on and on. There's physical upticks, and it's a long list. I'm just going to cut it short for our purposes. Flow states have triggers. Flow follows focus. It only shows up when all of our attention is focused in the right here, right now. So there are 22 triggers. All they do is they drive attention in the present moment. One of the biggest ones is what's sometimes talked about as the creativity trigger, the insight trigger. It's basically the idea that whenever the brain links two ideas together, you get a little squirt of the neurochemical dopamine. Dopamine is a feel-good reward chemical. It also focuses attention. And anybody who's ever done a crossword puzzle or Sudoku knows what I'm talking about. You get a right answer, that little rush of pleasure, that's dopamine. You're linking ideas together, right? That's so you get a bunch of dopamine flowing into your system, it will drive you into flow. It's sort of one of the ways flow triggers really work. There's some other stuff going on, but that's primary. So what happened in the 90s is it used to be in action sports up till literally like 91, 92. Fastest man or woman to the bottom was the winner. That was how we measured excellence, right? Suddenly in the 1990s, you got free surfing, free riding, free skiing. It was snowboarding happened basically. And snowboarding were these rebel dudes, and everybody wanted to be a snowboarder, right? Like that was the coolest thing you could possibly be. And they were free riding. So suddenly we were free skiing and free surfing. And it wasn't the fastest man or woman to the bottom anymore. It was the most creative line. And so how do you interpret the terrain creatively? As a skier, as a snowboarder, as a surfer, what is happening every time you make a creative decision? When you're skiing, you're getting a little bit of dopamine. Used to be you would only get dopamine from the risk you were taking and right, the one thing, and suddenly we're getting dopamine from tons of stuff. That's only one example, but that creativity became central to action sports culture. It was a value, right? You were having expression sessions and people privileged it and they talked about it and it got you laid in bars and all the incentives were in the right place. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to be gross, but it really did. And as a result, what massive uptick in flow. And because flow accelerates learning and it amplifies the path to mastery, what you had is a whole bunch of people who should have been dead by the end of the 90s who got incredibly successful. And you had group flow communities, and that's what happened, as far as I can tell.
I see. So you're, tied up in this world, you're writing about what you're seeing. And when do you decide to pivot and study flow and that become your passion and your direction?
So it was a very slow build. I started working on this in the late 90s, and I did it very cautiously, very slowly, and for I don't know, by 2005 or 2006, I started to notice that the people I had used to call for questions about flow were starting to call me. That started to happen, and I still didn't really think, "Oh, you should be a guy who's studying this stuff and whatever. This is a job for neuroscientists and psychologists. I have a creative writing master's." But I kept trying to get my friends to start, my neuroscience friends who I had gotten to know along the way and gotten to be very, very close to. A lot of people who mentored me along the way, and gave me way more time than a normal journalist would get. You know what I mean? I would spend weeks with people learning stuff and whatever. Um, I was trying to convince them to start a flow research organization, right? Because I didn't think I should do it. And it was a friend of mine I was I was researching my book Abundance, and I was at Singularity University, and was talking to a guy named Andrew Hessel. He's a synthetic biologist and a microbiologist, and he runs the Human Genome Right Project, which is basically the continuation of the Human Genome Project. It's the next phase. The Genome Project was about reading DNA. This is about writing DNA code. He runs that program, and he had started the world's very first nonprofit cancer research foundation that was trying to design end-to-one medicine, meaning cancer is a very individual disease. So just your cancer and my cancer are very, very different. And everybody's known for a while that the most effective cancer solutions will be end-to-one medicine, stuff designed exactly for your genome, your microbiome, et cetera, stuff we're seeing today. He was way ahead of his time, and he wanted to do this 10 years ago, and he couldn't. So he literally started a nonprofit cooperative. You buy into the cooperative, and should you get cancer, we will study and develop drugs specifically for you, because it allows you to go around the FDA. You don't have to. You can sort of circumvent a lot of laws and do a bunch of cool research, and it'd be a bunch of people who believed in it. And it was a really cutting edge, neat idea at the time. And I was sitting down talking to Andrew, who was teaching at Singularity University at the time, and he said, "Look, man, you can't get anybody to start your flow research collective organization, is because flow, as we know, this is an altered state of consciousness. It may boost performance, but nobody wants to talk about that out loud. Scientists can't get grant money for this. They can't get research, can't go to the NIH." And I knew he was right, because the week before I had been at a conference, invite only conference, very powerful neuroscientist ran the conference, controlled most of the research funding in America for government grants. And I pitched him what essentially became the company that I now run. And he's a nice guy, and he laughed in my face. He was sort of laughing with me, but he was basically like just cracked up. He's like, we can't do that inside a, so that had just happened to me. And I told Andrew the story, and he told me this story about how he was at a huge biopharmaceutical company, and wanted a division to study synthetic biology and cancer. That's all they want. He'd give me a research budget. I'll stay here. And they said, "No, it's too crazy. We won't do it." And he left the company to found his thing. And he said, "You got to do that. Do this." And he said, "I bet you that all those people who turned you down will sort of jump on your board and help you do it." And that's exactly what happened. So it took me a very long time until I was willing to do this, because I didn't want, I felt like it was somebody else, should do it. It turned out it worked very, very well, and it was exactly the right thing to do. But I was the last to know on this one, in a sense.
Stephen, talk about the first time that you were in flow, either knowingly or unknowingly.
It was unknowingly. I First time I was 13 years deep flow state, 13 years old. I was skiing at Seven Springs. It was February. I was skiing with my best friend. There was a girl on the chairlift. Vicky was her name, who I had a huge crush on. And to show off for Vicky on the chairlift, I threw my first back scratcher, which in the 70s was a cool trick. And dropped me right into flow. And I just remember time stopping. Like, I remember the skis sort of hit my back when I did the trick. And I just remember it. The first time I realized that time had slowed down was I realized my skis were still on my back. And that wasn't like, that shouldn't have been possible. Right. And it was the first time I remember, I was like, oh, wow, time is a thing that can slow down. Maybe I shouldn't tell anybody this, right? Like, I remember that, you know what I mean? It's flow is such a profoundly altered state that until, most people, first of all, we tend to remember flow states. So one of the easiest ways to, teach people about flow is say, well, think about the memories that are sort of seared into your brain over the course of your life that are positive. And as a general rule, this is the same reason that learning goes up in flow. You get a bunch of neurochemicals in the state that kind of make it feel so good. And what they do is, the more neurochemicals you get, better chance the experience will move from short-term holding into long-term storage. So flow is a big neurochemical dump. It's why it amplifies learning and memory so much. And we tend to, like, the highlights of our life tend to be flow states. That's what we tend to remember.
So part of your story has to do with having Lyme disease, and flow was part of, not knowingly, wasn't your treatment, but it ended up helping you. So just to put it in chronological order here, with the action sports and being part of that scene and doing your writing, where does Lyme disease end up making you bedridden for a few years?
So I spent my 20s as a freelance journalist. I wrote for about 100 different publications. By the end of the decade, I had worked my way onto staff at GQ, which then was the best magazine in America. Had like the coolest writers ever on staff. Just amazing, amazing writer. My colleagues were so scary good. Um, anyways, and I was about 30 years old. I just published my first novel, and I had been asking these questions about action sports for about 7 years, and I broke a lot of bones in action sports, because I'm not a professional athlete, and if you chase professional athletes around, you're gonna break things. I broke a lot of things, and it started to get very clear that if I, like, wanted to walk when I was older, I should probably stop trying to chase professional athletes around all the time. Um, I still haven't done that, by the way, but I thought it was a good idea at the time, and I had, I was looking at technology. There was a lot of sci-fi technology, impossible technology that was becoming possible, and I was reporting a lot on that, so I was already moving out of action sports a little bit as well and more into science and technology. Then I got Lyme disease and spent about 3 years in bed, lost everything, went bankrupt, lost that job, lost the girl I was gonna marry, the house, all of it. Um, and not the house. I um, didn't own a house at the time. Was going to buy a house. Lost all the money that I was going to use to buy a house because I tried to, find a cure. And at the end of it, after 3 years, the doctors knew I had Lyme disease at that point, but I was functional. I was clear headed. I could walk across a room or move or do anything about 10% of the time. Maybe an hour a day if I was lucky, but usually it was about a half an hour. And beyond that, I could sort of lie on the couch and moan a lot. Wasn't really good for anything. And so I was pretty suicidal, pretty depressed. Didn't think I was going to be useful for anything. Doctors didn't think I was ever going to get any better. And a friend of mine, as you pointed out, showed up at my house and demanded we go surfing. It was a crazy request. I couldn't walk across a room. I hadn't been on a surfboard in 5 years, but she wouldn't leave and she wouldn't leave. And she just kept badgering me and badgering me and badgering me. Like Lyme disease is it's like the worst flu you've ever had, crossed with paranoid schizophrenia. And like your head is really bad. And when somebody's sort of like badgering you, it's not like you have any normal defenses. You're like, it was freaking me out. And after like 3 hours, I was like, let's go surfing. I mean, I can always kill myself tomorrow. Please, anything, just shut up. Um, and she was totally right. She took me to a really friendly beginner wave. They had to carry me out to the break. They put me on a giant board, and muscle memory took over. A wave came. It was tiny. It was like a 2 foot wave, and I just spun the board around me and paddled twice and popped up my feet, and I um, popped up into a dimension that I didn't even know existed. Like I talked about time and slowed down at that time, peak and peak. This was absolute crawl, and I felt like I had panoramic vision, like I could see out of the back of my head, and I think one of those was at a minor out of body experience, and the most amazing part about it was that my head was clear and the pain was gone. Right? I mean, I had been unable to move basically for 3 years, and I felt amazing. And after I caught that wave felt so good. I caught 4 more waves that day, I think 5 total. And then they just drove me home and poured me into bed. And like people had to bring me food for the next 2 weeks because I couldn't walk. And on the 15th day, I went back to the ocean. Just something about it was so compelling to me. So like I was the only time I had not felt pain and felt happy. And 3 years, I did it again. And same profound, weird, altered state. And over a course of about 7 months, I went from 10% functional to 80% functional. And I was, I'm a science guy. I'm a rational materialist. Surfing is not a known cure for chronic autoimmune conditions. So what the hell is going on was question one. And more importantly, Lyme is only fatal if it gets into your brain. And I'm a science guy and I'm having quasi mystical experiences out in the waves, and stuff's happening to me that like I'm not talking about. I think I'm going mad. I think the disease is in my brain. So even though I'm feeling better, I'm just lying to myself, and it's a question of time. And so I set out to figure out what the hell was going on, and I very quickly figured out, oh wait a minute, these altered state experiences, and I had been hearing about these altered state experiences. I had had some of them. Some of the athletes I had been studying were talking about them. But you have to understand, like, I remember the first time I had a conversation with Laird Hamilton about flow, it just sounded like crazy hippie nonsense. You are, and it is, and that's it. And I was just like, I don't know what that is, but like, you know what I mean? I have that experience, but I don't like, I don't know what that is. And so then I finally found out, wait a minute, these things are called flow states. And right then, Herb Benson, he was at Harvard, was doing some work on the neurochemicals that show up in flow And he realized that as we move into flow, there's a global release of nitrous oxide in it. What it does is it flushes all the stress hormones out of your system. And Lyme disease is essentially a nervous system gone haywire. And it can't one of the problems with chronic Lyme, one of the things that happens is we're a homeostatic organism, but your nervous system stops being able to find homeostasis with any long autoimmune condition, right? You don't know where normal is. So your body can't return you to where it's supposed to go. But if you flush all the stress hormones out, that's reset. That's normal. So, and on top of that, the neurochemicals that underpin flow are all pretty serious immune system boosters, right? They do a lot of work that way. It's why we don't like, you get a lot of dopamine and norepinephrine in your system. That's sort of the cocktail for romantic love. We don't get sick when we're falling in love with people because of this prophylactic effect, right? So he had argued in his book, The Breakout Principle, that many so called cases of spontaneous healing seem to have this flow based mechanism at their heart. And now we actually, it's 20 years, 25 years, 20 years later, and there's actually really interesting kind of neuroimmunological data that further supports all these ideas. But back then, this was all very groundbreaking. And what I quickly sort of put together very quickly, this is the end of the long story, is that, hey, wait a minute, the same state that helped me go from subpar back to normal, hey, it's helping normal people go all the way up to Superman. That's the thing I've been seeing all along, because you're seeing a ton of shit, right? It's hard to say, oh, this is the thing that's working. This is the reason these guys are, yeah, men and women are doing the impossible. This is why it's happening in science. There's a lot of factors. You're looking at a ton of shit to go, oh, this is the thing. You sort of had to, I got lucky. I got hit on the head with it because of my illness. And I happened to be the guy who was doing all the research. And so I was the guy who went, oh, wow, wait a minute. It'll work this way. I don't think I was also the first guy to notice that, but I was probably the first guy to write books about it.
All right, a lot to unpack there. And I'm just curious, this was at 30 when you had this flare out from Lyme. How long before that do you think you contracted it?
I contracted it at a wedding in upstate New York. I got the disease in May. Um, I noticed something was wrong at Burning Man, actually, in '99. And then my girlfriend and I were moving to Los Angeles like 2 weeks later. And halfway through the drive there, we had a stick shift and my left leg stopped working. I couldn't put it on the freeway, and I couldn't get my leg, the muscles wouldn't work. And I couldn't, like, I had to pull over for like 2 hours, and then it went away. But that was the first time and it was, by the time they diagnosed me, it was almost a year later. Problem was I had been in Africa as a reporter. I'd worked all over Africa that year. So for a really long time, they thought I had every tropical ailment known to man. So it was really hard to figure out what was wrong with me.
I see. And you mentioned contracting it at a wedding. Did you know at the time you were bitten by a tick?
Now, but I was at a wedding in upstate New York in Long Island, and it was the only places I had been. I had been in the jungle in Madagascar where there's no Lyme at the time. I had been in the desert in Utah, work doing an entomological survey in a slot canyon for National Geographic, and then I had been in the mountains in the winter skiing. So the only place where there were ticks that I was at, and I went for a walk in the arboretum between the ceremony and the dinner. Um, and we think that's where I got bit.
It's interesting to think this girl who was a friend of yours that kept nagging you to go surfing. It's interesting to think, your health was in such a bad place and didn't seem like it was going to be, heading out of that realm anytime soon, where you might be if you didn't jump on that surfboard that day.
Yeah, Andrew's a pretty amazing woman. She's also a very deep in the action sports world, and she works with a lot of dying patients. That's what she does for a living. She does PT for hospice care, and so I think she had a better understanding of like the importance of my mental health in the situation than anybody else. Like she had the exact right skill set, but yeah, I owe her big time for that one.
So you talked about that near mystical experience on the surfboard. Talk more about what that was like. And did you share what you went through with anybody at that time?
No,
I think you said you thought
no,
you might be going
yeah,
crazy,
the
so you
first
probably wanted to keep it to yourself. But talk about what you went through exactly, and you're saying you didn't share it.
Meaning the experience itself? I mean, time slowed down. I was floating outside my body. I had panoramic vision, and I felt great. That's not mystical enough for you. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Was this an atypical flow response because of the lime?
Oh, oh no. So, it is. It was an atypical flow response because I had been in so much pain for so long. So you right, I had nothing. I had no normal reality to compare it to. I was in the worst so it wasn't like normal people flow is the best they get to feel on the planet. But I had been in hell for 3 years and I didn't think I was coming out of it. I thought the only relief I was going to get was killing myself. So like to suddenly, it was that was what and that was part of it. And while you do get in flow oneness with everything and extreme time dilation, all this stuff that happened, I mean, we understand the biology of it. You don't get it all at once. Even like, you know what I mean? Like we can train people to make flow reliable and repeatable. And so you're, getting into flow every day when you're, doing your core work or, I go skiing 90% of the time I go skiing, I'm in flow. But that, like the oneness with everything, the extreme oneness with everything, extreme time dilation, those are rare because they require a slightly flow is a spectrum experience, and those experience this is the far edge of the up spectrum. You can get there, but it usually takes like 4 or 5 other variables. It also usually often takes a lot of risk. You have to remember that like I thought I was risking my life even in 2-foot waves because I thought, wow, if I fall off this surfboard and nobody's, they can't get to me quickly, I'm not strong enough to get to claw. I can claw myself to the surface, but like I knew how to surf. I knew, you know what I mean? I knew what the ocean can do, and the wrong 3-foot wave, and I was out of strength. I didn't think my lungs could handle it, all that stuff. So the risk, my perceived risk, which often influences how much dopamine you get in an experience, was through the roof also. So I was in perfect conditions for a really profound flow state. What it was compared to was really weird. I will tell you what is unusual. I kept having these quasi mystical deep flow experiences for like 4 or 5 months. That's really unusual. That's weird. That doesn't tend to show up very often for people. That's not kind of normally how flow would work. It would diminish, like you would get less of the stuff as your system got more used to it. Which is actually a great thing for peak performance because it's no longer one of the problems that people have with flow often is when people get into flow and they haven't been there before, they don't know how to work with the state, they don't understand it. It's sort of like the first time you get stoned. You're like, oh my God, this feels so good. Look at the pretty trees. And you don't realize that you're in a state of peak performance. It's rare and you should use it for like it's designed to do a specific thing. It's not designed, you know, as a stoner experience, but it's not a tourist experience. It's an active state that has a function. And so you have to sort of learn your way around. Oh, that was the other thing that happened with the action sport athletes. They got super used to these deeper flow states. And when you get super used to the deeper flow states, you can work with them. You're less of a tourist, right? Flow's a very profound altered state of consciousness. It takes a bunch of experience inside the state. Start to understand, oh wow, I'm not like there are actually limits inside a flow state, right? And like once you work with it, you don't tend to do stupid things that athletes will do, like think that they can suddenly, oh, I'm in flow, so I should jump a 50-foot cliff when I've never jumped a 20-foot cliff. That happens with people who don't know what they're doing with the state. But the longer you work with it, the more you can know exactly what it's going to bring you, how to work within it, how to maximize it for performance. So
You talked about how after your surfing experience, you would go in and out of that mystical state more than you would typically expect for somebody. What was different about you that was happening to you at that time?
on average, neurobiologically, flow should last 90 minutes, meaning the neurochemical, like for example, norepinephrine and dopamine at peak concentration, they last 20 minutes in the brain. Why are TED Talks long, 10, 20 minutes long? Because our two major focusing chemicals last 20 minutes. So at peak concentration, right, flow will stretch out because there's starter chemicals, there's stuff on the tail end, the serotonin that shows up at the back end lasts a little longer, and that the afterglow effect can last a couple of days. That's average. Alan Lukes, who runs Big Brothers Big Sisters, he discovered back in the 90s, I want to say, helper's high. It's an altruism based flow state. And on average, it can last a day, maybe two. We don't know why, right? We're not, give you another one. This is not my research, but heightened creativity that shows up in flow. it's huge. It's a 400 to 700 boost. And then when I say creativity, I'm talking about all aspects of the creative decision process. So like idea generation, problem identification, all the little subsets that go into creative problem solving. Teresa Amabile at Harvard figured out that heightened creativity will outlast the flow state by a day, maybe two. We don't know why yet. So there's all kinds of time and duration questions in and around flow. And like my experience, or I'll give you another one that's really common in the world. Startup teams, entrepreneurship is a big driver of flow for a lot of similar reasons. Startups will, as they're moving towards product launch, sometimes you'll hear tales where like the whole company is showing up, and every time they're at work, everybody's in a flow state together, like one group flow state, and like the 3 weeks up to product launch or whatever, you get this like 3-week long group flow state. It turns off when people go home and it turns back on, right? That's not uncommon. This is just the far edge. We've been trying to figure out, where does it come from? How do we get more of it? How do we work with it? Right? These weird questions about time, while we want to answer them, they're not, like things we really want to know is, wow, can this stuff really boost the immune system? How do we use that? How do we deploy that in healthcare? Can it really accelerate learning? Cool. How do we use that in education? Those are the questions. Or can we use this, if it flow bumps productivity 500%? I spend a tremendous amount of time in business working with organizations, teaching them how to utilize that stuff. They're less interested in, hey, why did your mystical experience show up 30 times in 3 months? So I don't have a better answer for me. There's an answer out there, and I think sooner or later we'll get to it. But right now we're still trying to like make it as practical and pragmatic as possible, I think.
And you talked about startups and how they can come in to work together, get into that flow state, go home, kind of leave it or taper out of it, and then come back in and be in that flow state as a group. And the major focus of your book is being, it's more of an individualistic approach. But I'd like, while we're on that subject, let's talk about that group flow and how flow can be, something teams can use as to their advantage.
It's really a big thing teams can use for their advantage. So when we talked about the things that flow can amplify, flow also amplifies cooperation, collaboration, communication, group creativity, all those things as well. And as you pointed out, there's a individual flow, and then there's a shared collective flow state, right? And this could be what's known as interpersonal flow. So this is me and you, Jesse. We're in a great conversation. We're lost in, right? That's interpersonal flow. You can have group flow. There can be team flow. There's even communitas, which is flow at scale. So you go to a rock concert, right? Get lost in the music with you, and you become one with the crowd and the band. And that's communitas. It's flow at scale. That was actually the very first flow that was sort of discovered and researched. That the term Goethe was the very first person, the German writer, to look at flow. He coined the term Rausch, which is German for flow, and he was trying to figure out how people go to these Dionysian. They basically go to Oktoberfest, right? People get drunk, they dance a lot. They had like German Burning Man, 18th century German Burning Man, and he wanted to know, well, what the hell's going on? What is this? So that was where I think flow research really starts at that end of the scope. But now it's really crucial because we see all the collaboration stuff, and the short version of this is most of the skills that we really need the most in the 21st century, whether it's well-being, meaning, purpose, right? Those kinds of desires we have, or creativity, collaboration, cooperation. The difficulty we have had so far, even flow, in training these things, is they're not exactly skills, right? They're states of consciousness. Great collaboration is a shared state of consciousness, and that's not an obvious thing, right? It's not an obvious thing if you're working with a corporation that, oh wow, what's really at the heart of this is this weird. There's brain entrainment, there's group flow, there's all. It's a less than obvious thing to kind of discover that. So this is where we are with it. And what I like to say with the bounds of flow knowledge and this peak performance, and the reason the art of impossible focuses on the individual so much, is the whole idea behind the book is peak performance is getting your biology work for you rather than against you. Well, I know what your individual biology is. And there's a lesson in there that says, or a message in the book that says, personality doesn't scale, biology scales, right? What works for me probably isn't going to work for you. because too many things that go into personality play a real deep role in peak performance. So it's very individual. But go one level down beneath that, there's a shared neurobiology. That's the level you can learn from and train from, and it's very effective for everybody. But what's the shared biology of a company, right? You don't like that's an unanswered question. So what I always say is like we know how the boundedness of like peak performance knowledge goes up to sort of organizations, and then with organizations we can be very effective, not just my company and people in this field working with individual companies. You can figure out, okay, this is the biology of your company. This is how we should do this with your company. These are the things that work. Let's try it this way. I don't think you can make blanket statements. Like I couldn't write a book, Art of Impossible, for corporate America. As much as all this stuff is very applicable and can be imported into institutions and is already doing it, and we train institutions based on these ideas, but I don't think I don't think you can make blanket across the board statements and say, oh yeah, this thing is going to work for all organizations, because we don't have like what is the shared biology of all organizations. Now I will say a very brilliant woman who I work with on my staff, Claire Saros, is organizational psychologist, has been arguing that complexity science gives us the biology of organizations, and if we started thinking about the problem that way, we might make some headway. And I think she's farther along towards right than anybody I've seen so far. I just think we're at the front end of that research.
Earlier, Stephen, you talked about when you ski, about 90% of the time you're getting into flow, at least at this point. And you talked about creativity and how on the tail end of flow, we were more creative. I think you said for a day or two, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. But are you using, in your case, skiing as a tool and then coming back and then writing like before you're going to have like a heavy couple days of writing and use that as an actual tool?
Yes. So a couple of things. Absolutely. So when we work with people, one of the first things we do with people, as you know, Art Impossible starts with motivation, and it really intrinsic motivation. That's if you're interested in a quest for peak performance, you're going to have to do some foundational work there. First is usually is you because you sort of want to follow your biology in. That said, at the same time you're doing that, we always train people. Everybody's got what you would call a primary flow activity. This is whatever you did as a kid that just produced the most flow. Maybe it was dancing to hip hop, right? Maybe it was doing what I did, going to the Natural History Museum and staring at dinosaur bones. And you know what I mean? Like whatever it was, there was a thing, or skiing, which I did as a kid. And as we get to be adults, we have kids, we have families, we have jobs, we have responsibilities. Usually the thing that we park first. We're like, oh yeah, but I'm going to put away the surfboard or the skateboard or the dinosaur bones because I got to make a living. And it's the single dumbest thing we can do, and it's for a couple of reasons. One, flow is a focusing skill. In the same way that mindfulness is a kind of a focusing skill, but it's a different kind of focus than we use in mindfulness in a sense. A- And like anything else, the more flow you get, the more flow you get. It's a skill, right? You're training the brain to focus attention in a specific way. So when I go skiing on Monday, my chances of getting into flow at work on Thursday go up in general, right? And this is true. I also think for if I go skiing alone, even my chances of getting into group flow on Thursday also go up, right? As well as it appears. That's not a definitive statement, but I think that last statement is true. Also, flow resets the nervous system. It calms you the fuck down. One of the biggest breaks in peak performance is anxiety. Real problem, right? And especially in the modern world, especially in 2021, stuff we're up against, there's a lot of anxiety, right? This is a real break on peak performance. Flow is going to reset the nervous system. It's training your brain to get into flow. And as you pointed out, the heightened creativity is going to outlast the flow state by a day, by maybe two. So the first thing we want people to start doing when you start working with us is stop making time in your life for your primary flow activity. And the other bonus is the huge amount of joy and pleasure and well-being and meaning that sort of starts to reboot, right? If you're sort of feeling dead inside, this is the fastest way to come back alive.
And you mentioned this would be the first thing you'd recommend to somebody who's getting into this. Let's take that a little bit further. If they're doing that and this whole flow thing is new to somebody, what else can they stack on to that to try and get to a flow state for the beginner here?
I'm going to give your listeners a tool. So the book starts, as I said, it starts with motivation, and it really starts with, hey, here's curiosity, which is our basic motivator. Curiosity is designed, we've built into passion. Passion, when I say designed, I mean biologically designed. Just passion is supposed to be built into purpose. Once you have purpose, then you can get into some other kind of foundational motivators and things like that. But that's sort of the first thing that has to get done. And that's Art Impossible kind of lays that out in really long form. You really want it that way. But if you go to the passionrecipe.com, that chunk of the book, we just turned it into a really cool, actually interactive PDF workbook for people, and that's for your listeners can have that. So I would start there, reboot your primary flow activity, and then usually what I tell people, if you want to go the next step in this, um, there's some goal setting stuff, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the goal around goals and grit that I think is important. But what I'm going to talk about um, a little bit is sort of what I would call the positive psychology basics. So positive psychology has spent about 30 years really, really, really looking at the same question. How do you get people from zero up to Superman, right? The idea with positive psychology is most of psychology was about fixing what was broken, getting you from subpar to zero. And positive psychology, especially as visualized by Martin Seligman and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, sort of the godfathers of it, was, hey, let's move the needle the other way. So it's been going on for 30 years, and there's about 6 things that are considered the positive psychology basics. And they're not, you don't have to do all 6, but you got to think about them this way. So there's 3 on the physical side, energy side. Obviously, if you're going to perform at your best, you need a certain level of energy. So there's 3 things that have the biggest impact on your energy. The first is you have to sleep 7 to 8 hours a night. If you want to regulate your emotions, regulate your nervous system, perform at your best, there's no way around it. Like you can measure your sleep. You can use all the sleep apps. You can go as crazy as you want. You could blow this up. You could say, oh no, I'm wired differently, not me. You're lying. Like it's the whole human species needs to sleep 7 to 8 hours a night. That's just what it is. We also need good hydration and good nutrition. We all know this. Like this is not, there's no one diet that's going to work for everybody. Drink a shitload of water, eat good food, right? Not it. That's that. And then the last one is interesting. Most people know this is important, but they don't know it's important on the energy side of the equation, which is social support. Chris Peterson, brilliant positive psychologist at the University of Michigan, says you can summarize 30 years of positive psychology in one phrase: other people matter. We're social animals, and I always explain to people this way: if you get in a fight with your spouse, your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your brother, your mom, your boss, how much energy do you have the next day? How do you feel? Right? The opposite is also true. If you really want to perform at your best, you need even more social support. And the reason is this: whenever you face a challenge, which is any challenge in the real world, right? This is how do you react when you stub your toe, to how do you react to a bad thing on Facebook. Any challenge you deal with, the brain performs microsecond risk analysis in every situation, right? And whenever you face a problem, one of the things the brain says is, hey, you going solo into this problem, or you got posse? Because if you got posse, maybe you can be a little calmer. But if you're solo, that problem is a big problem and you should be panicked, right? That happens all the time at a subconscious level. We're not aware of it. What we're aware of is how tired we are. How much energy do I have to bring to the situation? We're not aware of the fact that the brain's performing these microsecond by microsecond calculations. So on the energy side, what I like to tell people is under normal conditions, meaning not normal 2021 conditions, but under normal conditions, you can screw up one of these once a day, right? Maybe you ate crappy food last night for dinner or whatever, but you slept 7 to 8 hours and you've got a good social network and you had a really good conversation with your wife in the morning or whatever. Yeah, you can sort of get by and probably perform at your best that day anyways. Can't do it 2 or 3 times in a row, but a couple times a week, if you screw up one of these, you could still be a peak performer, right? But you have to know about those 3 things because they're sort of foundational. You just got to do them. And then there's this flip side, is the cognitive side. And anxiety blocks peak performance in today's society for a variety of reasons that we can go into later if you want. We're pretty much hypervigilant all the time. We're revved up for a lot of different reasons. And so we actually have to calm ourselves down a lot. And the 3 best ways to do it are a 5-minute daily gratitude practice, 11 to 20 minutes of mindfulness, or 20 to 40 minutes of exercise. Those are the best ways to sort of calm our brain down. And I could talk about why each one works, or I go deeper, but the point here is under normal conditions, you should do one a day, right? You don't have to do all three, but you should do one of those things a day to sort of manicure your kind of mind. And under crisis conditions, you should do two of them a day. And a daily gratitude practice takes 5 minutes. So there's, that's an easy one. That's a simple one that we can all kind of lean towards, and it really does it tunes a lot of different things in the brain very effectively. It also, this is work. So the world's leading expert on the neuroscience of gratitude is Dr. Glenn Fox. He's at USC. We did a really cool study with him recently. We found that people who have regular gratitude practices are more flow prone than others. So, um, but anyways, so that, like, when I start people on this process, I always start with the passion recipe, rebooting your primary flow activity, and these positive psychology basics, because this is foundational. Just sort of, this gets you into the peak performance arena. You're entering the conversation a little bit.
Well, what's interesting about all those things you named are they're typical things that come up on the show each and every week. I mean, these are the things that we do to maintain our health and well-being on a general level. Plus, now they're going to help us get into flow.
And the flow, I mean, it's not just flow, they help grit, they help intrinsic motive. I mean, they do a lot of heavy lifting on a lot of different systems. And yeah, I always, what I've said to people all along, that the cool thing about Art of Impossible is, if you're a peak performer at all, if you know any of this stuff, right? First of all, this stuff, a lot of it's going to be familiar to you. But there have been lots of great books on slices of this. Here's focus, here's gratitude, here's mindfulness, here's mindset, here's flow, right? I've even written some of these books. This neuroscience has finally advanced to the point that this is the first time I think somebody's laid down the full big picture. Here's what it all looks like in a sequence as a system. Here's how they all work together. That to me, um, is what's really cool about this book for people who know about this stuff, right? People who've been listening to your show for a while, these are all the things you hit. This is how they work together. This is how they're designed to work together, and this is why they work so effectively. And they really are sort of part of a system. And if you understand what you're doing with the system, if you understand the neurobiology underneath it just a little bit, right? You have sort of basic cognitive literacy. You start to see how they interplay, and then you start to be able to say things like, "Oh wow, I'm not going to get enough sleep on Thursday. Okay, I know that. So if I'm gonna, this is what I should do instead. This is what you can start to be able to make a lot wiser decisions, I think."
So, other than the general recommendation, eating a healthy diet, being well hydrated, are there specific substances that can help us get into flow? Things like caffeine, certain supplements. I know nootropics, they're a popular topic these days with the biohacking community. Are there certain things that we can take as adjuncts to a healthy diet and hydration to get into that flow state more readily?
This probably is not going to earn me the love of a lot of your listeners, but we at the collective, at the Flow Research Collective, and me personally, I work with psychological and physiological interventions. I don't work with substances, and I don't work with technologies. And it's not that caffeine can't help some people get into flow or other things can't. It's that everybody's very individual on how that's going to work, first of all. And if I'm being really dramatic and I want to answer this, what I say is, back when I was a journalist, on 5 different occasions, I was shot at. And at no point when somebody was shooting at me could I say, "Excuse me, sir, would you put out down that AK-47 while I take this pill or drink this cup of coffee or use this technology so my brain can get into flow and I can dodge your bullets," right? That's just not how the world works. And when your boss says, "Hey, Jesse, get in here and I need that presentation we're going to do next week, you got to do it now, and you got to do it for my boss and her boss," or, the one that we deal with in our daily lives all the time, which is, "Hey, honey, can I talk to you for a minute?" Right? "Hey, honey, can I talk to you for a minute?" Well, hold on a second while I, microdose this whatever, and doesn't work that way. I want something that's reliable and repeatable and works all the time and is inside of myself. So we go for psychological and physiological triggers for that reason. And it's not that there aren't technologies or substances that are effective. They're very individual. I haven't seen any technologies that are completely effective with flow. Flow's still like, I like what my lab's building more than I like anything that I've seen out there, but even we're still ways away, I think. Um, but on the substance side, all the neurotropics, as far as I can tell, are completely individual, and I have never found anything that produces more than a placebo effect. I think the turmeric for inflammation, fish oil for inflammation are useful, and that's about the extent of everything else I take. Maybe some vitamin C, but I eat a lot of vegetables and eat a lot of fruits.
What is it your company's building? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so there's multiple stages to it, but what we're building right now is depending on how you want to phrase it, biophysical based flow detector. Something right now we can measure flow, but we measure it. Flow is psychologically defined by 6 core characteristics: complete concentration in the present moment, the merger of action awareness. We've been talking a lot about time dilation, time passing strangely, the vanishing of self, etc. So what we do is we give people subjective questionnaires. Hey, in this experience, how much did time go away? Scale of 1 to 5, that kind of stuff. That's how we do it. It turns out it's a very effective way. Like you can get a lot farther than you would suspect asking those kind of questions and doing that kind of research. Um, but that's still subjective. We want to be able to measure physiological signals, biological signals. That's what we're developing. Once we have that, we would then move towards building probably an app of some kind that will help. It'll tell you where you are. Here's how you move towards flow. Our goal is to partner with a virtual reality or augmented reality company and create AI-driven accelerated learning virtual environments to be used in education or for worker retraining. That's sort of where that arm of the research is going. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that I would be happy just to be able to measure flow in the body, but the downstream applications and worker retraining is especially interesting to me. I grew up in Cleveland. I grew up in sort of very blue collar worlds, and there are, because of autonomy, trucking is the largest blue collar employer in America right now, and autonomous trucks are here. Right, they're going to start rolling out over the next 3 to 5 years, and all those people are going to have to be retrained for cool jobs. And we are getting really good at being at right. If I can increase learning 250%, wow, that's a much better worker retraining program than right. And VR is very good at getting at flows triggers, and AI can make it individually customized. The same thing can be used in school as well. And I just don't want to take it into education myself because I don't want to get into a curriculum battle with parents. Like, I think somebody else should figure out what to teach the kids. I can build the system, but you guys got to figure out what you should teach your children. I'm not in that fight.
As you talk about flow and get into what that experience is like, the mystical experience, lost of sense of self, what pops into my head is psychedelics and the impact those have on a person. So I'm just curious, is there a lot of research showing overlap between a psychedelic experience and what it's like being in a flow state?
The only research that's been done is the study. We teamed up with Robin Card Harris's lab at Imperial College in London. We worked with specifically a guy named Mendel Kaleem. Robin's lab is done all the brain imaging work on psychedelics, DMT, MDMA, LSD, and psilocybin. They've done brain imaging work on it. And then we did comparison contrast studies. And so we have really interesting data on, we know what psychedelics are useful for that flow states are not, and what flow states are useful for where psychedelics fail, and all kinds. So we do have a bunch of stuff there. Um, and I think what we can tell you about psychedelics is that there's some interesting research on psychedelics and creativity as enhancers for creativity. It appears that flow is better than psychedelics, especially for a kind of practical creativity. Like, if you're where psychedelics have a true advantage is if you're interested in having synesthesia. So if you want to taste colors, for example, psychedelics win. If you want to have a spiritual experience, psychedelics outperform flow. And propensity to have a terrible experience, psychedelics outperform flow. You don't have a bad time in a flow state, you can have a bad trip. Um, Other than that, flow seems, from a practical perspective, flow is the better tool to reach for. But for trauma, I mean, flow is useful for trauma, but I mean, this is where, right, like, I don't work in trauma, that's not my work, but like, the trauma work with psychedelics is amazing. Right? The stuff we're seeing with PTSD is brilliant. And I'm not saying that there isn't going to be a use for psychedelics and creativity down the line. But as of right now, it appears that flow is more effective. And it's not the work. My old company did some of that work with psychedelics, and I actually left because I just wanted to stay focused on flow. Mostly because I think there's a lot of people in psychedelics right now who are doing really sort of good work. You know what I mean? What Tim Ferriss is doing with Roland Griffith at Hopkins is amazing. What Robbins like there's that work is being done. My work has always been flow. So I don't pay as much attention to it. But what I've seen is the therapeutic stuff is amazing. If you're interested in performance or creativity, flow appears to be better. But again, may not be true for you, right? This may be, true for everybody else. You could be an exception on this one. I don't know. Some people really love their psychedelics, and I want to stand between them and their psychedelics.
Gotcha. And besides humans, is there any research showing that other animals get into flow?
Yeah, that was actually how the first conversation I ever had with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow psychology. I was researching my book, Small Furry Prayer. My wife and I run a dog sanctuary, and we do hospice care and special needs care for very sick and very old dogs. And we have a flow-based protocol. And I was seeing my dogs get into flow states, and with me, and I can go into why I knew it was flow and whatever, but it doesn't. I called by emailed Mike, and I was like, "You don't know me, but I've written a book about flow, and we do this, and I see flow in my dogs. Are you?" And it turns out, yeah, flow, horses as well, and most mammals are equipped, like can get into flow. And it used to be ferrets was the line. We thought that it was because ferrets were not supposed to be able to produce anandamide, which is one of the chemicals that shows up in flow, but that's not true. Turns out that anandamide and the endocannabinoid system is conserved in most mammals. So now we don't know we used to think ferrets was the cutoff line, like all sort of mammals sort of above ferrets in an evolutionary sense could get into flow and below that. But that turns out to be, that was true for 10 years and now it's no longer true. And now we can't tell you, but it seems like, um, and it seems like birds can also get into flow because flocking behavior seems like a group flow behavior also.
Talk more about the animal sanctuary. How is that something you and your wife became involved in, and how much of a role does that take place in your day to day?
I've started every day of my life since I was, I don't know, 33 by cleaning up dog shit. So like that's how my day starts. So for when you do hospice care and special needs care, and you have a lot of animals, you can't get everybody to go to the bathroom outside, and we live family style with our dogs. So like, the impact is sort of enormous and fun. And we deal with a lot of like my impact is a little higher because like we have a lot of feral animals and animals that really abused animals. So I have to be careful when I walk through my own home because my dogs will bite me, kind of thing. But no, I've always been an animal geek. I've loved animals since I was a little kid. A lot of my early forays into science were actually in studying animals, and a lot of the I think one of the reasons I got a lot farther in the flow work than some other people who have come to this is because I came in with kind of a really complete knowledge of evolutionary biology and ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. A lot of these things were the early sciences that I learned. And when I was a reporter, I spent a lot of time covering it. And when I met my wife and she was doing animal rescue, mostly I was like, wow, I could do this and live with a pack of dogs and cool. I didn't know what I was getting in for. And, we don't do this anymore, but for uh, 14 years, we lived in the second poorest county in America with the highest incidence of animal cruelty. So we were on the front lines, and we were doing really hardcore rescue work. Um, my wife will tell you that if you're interested in altruism and you're not working on the front lines, you're full of shit. You're just talking. And I don't necessarily know if I agree with her, but I can tell you after spending a decade on the front lines of a heartbreaking cause, it's a different picture.
So where do you go next, Stephen? You got your new book, Art of Impossible, coming out. You've been in this flow world and sharing this message for so long. Where do you see your career going in the next 5 years?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, I'm trained originally as a novelist, believe it or not, and I've been writing novels all along, but I've leaned harder into that. So I've got a novel coming out 9 months from now. It's my third one. So I see myself doing more of that. The flow research is, that timetable, the stuff that I laid out for you, that is 5 years worth of work, probably maybe six. My next big There's a lot of flow neuroscience and neurobiology, and like way more science papers from me will show up over the next 5 years that have showed up over recently. And my next big book is going to be on intuition. That's where I'm going next. I think it's the last uncharted territory for peak performance. And flow, obviously, intuition is very turned up in flow, and a special kind of intuition is turned up in flow. Most of the work that has been done on intuition is sort of like short term. Don't walk down that alley because you're getting a bad vibe, or what kind of decision you're going to make in the present moment. But that's not how most people use intuition. Most of us steer long distance and into the future, right? Like artists, myself, I'll have a hunch that there's a book sort of at the intersection of this idea about surfing and neuroscience. And 10 years later, it'll become West of Jesus. That's how creative intuition works a lot. It's what Stephen Johnson talks about as a slow hunch. He talks about that in one of his books on innovation. So I'm interested in slow hunch innovation. If I were to put it formally in science terms, I am interested in how the goal-directed system works over time and how it communicates with us through, the only difference between intuition and insight is insight, we have words. Intuition, we don't have words, so we have to get signals and fuzzier things, right? So how do we do long-term goal direction in an intuitive, meaning nonverbal way? That's sort of the question I'm trying to ask, but I think it's really a lot of the really cool puzzles that are next are sort of right there. So that's where I'm going.
And do you feel like intuition has been a guiding force throughout your life, or is this more of a recent thing that you've delved into?
So I haven't parsed it out to intuition. Creativity has been a lifelong, interest, and some of the research on creativity that's in Art of Impossible is some of the oldest work I've done. Right, some of it even predates the work I did on flow. So been very interested in creativity for a very, very long time, and intuition sort of is a subset of it. I also want to understand insight as well. To me, they're the same sort of puzzle. And yeah, I am a very intuitive decision maker. Um, and a very good intuitive decision maker. I make intuitive decisions, and they tend to be very right. And that's interesting to me personally. I don't use myself as a case study in this stuff at all. That to me isn't real. It happens to me. It doesn't mean it happens to anybody else, and I can use that to do anything with. But at a personal level, yeah, I do. I steer a lot that way. I'm very, very, very hardcore rational, as you can tell. But to me, that's not it. Like good rational, hardcore rational is also intuitive. I don't think they're I don't think they're in opposition in that way. I just think you have intuitions, and then you do research to prove your intuitions.
You mentioned 9 months from now, your fiction novel's coming out. How hard as a writer do you find it to switch, between writing fiction and nonfiction, to go into those 2 different zones?
I actually think to me, it's this. I've written so many nonfiction books in a row, and nonfiction books, because they're so research intensive. And if you're not research intensive, you usually have to find a collaborator, and then you have all the like issues of collaboration, which can be really, really fun. But you're two people working together on something that you deeply care about. That's never easy, right? It just isn't. So fiction is it's just, I mean, like, I work with the same editor I have for like 25 years, and when we're working on my novels, we just laugh nonstop. It is more, like, I cannot believe that anybody actually pays me for fiction, right? The other stuff I've come to believe that maybe it has some value in the world, so I can see why I get paid. But like fiction is just so fun. It's a beast. Also, fiction is also some of the really hard writing problems as an artist um, are stuff that happens in fiction. Like fiction is a really good place to solve some of those problems. So I love pushing on my craft. Fiction is a great place for it. And I've also, let's be clear, I have written huge, huge bestsellers, been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes for my nonfiction, blah, blah, blah. I haven't done any of that stuff in fiction, right? I've written two local, I was an Amazon cyberpunk bestseller, and I was a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller. So that's a mountain I have yet to climb. So I like that challenge also.
Well, it's interesting reading your book and hearing about how much you put into each of your books. You're a true artist when it comes to this. I mean, there's some writers out there that are putting out New York Times bestselling books almost on a yearly basis. And you talk about one of your books in your new book, you talk about spending 15 years writing it.
Yeah, new book is actually somebody calculated it. They wanted to find the oldest bit of research in the book, and they went, okay, it was somebody on my team, it's 30 years old.
That's fresh.
Yeah, they exactly. Like, I've been working on this book for 30 years. So yeah, but I did that also. Tomorrowland's another book that took 20 some years. Um, I like those kind of projects sometimes. You know what I mean? Some of them are fun that way.
You do this amazing breakdown in the book, and it's something I'm gonna definitely take, and have as a memory and bring up from time to time, is the fact that you get more value from reading a book versus a blog post versus an article because, and again, I'm not gonna get all the numbers right, but you break it down in your book, what goes into writing a blog post versus an article versus a book, and to take 5, 10 hours of your time to read a book like The Art of Impossible and to get 30 years of your distilled knowledge, like, what a value to the reader.
Yeah, it's the calculation's crazy, right? Because it's just like it's return on investment. How much of my time as an author are you giving me for your 5 or 6 hours in the book, right? Versus, and when you actually look at it that way, you would just read from books because it's the most condensed knowledge form available. It so outperforms listening to talks, listening to all that stuff. There's a million different reasons, but it's the everybody's interested in accelerated learning. I'm so shocked by how many, the two things that people come to me over and over since, and the ROI on reading the section chapter right after that, which is the 5 books is stupid, which is how to learn any subject basically, and where to learn from is the ROI on reading, and how to learn any subject, and it's what people have been talking to me the most about, and I was surprised by it, but it doesn't surprise me because every super super successful person I've ever met has read their way there. Um, it's just you don't. There's a thing that you can't say out loud, but I'm going to say it anyways, which is um, smart people have a word for people who don't read books. We call them dumb. And it's like there's just no way around that particular truth. Like, books are the most condensed form of knowledge on the planet. You can't beat it. And if you're really interested in developing your own ideas, right, and not just being a parrot, but actually getting enough information in your head to start being able to work with it and take it in your own way and really sort of start contributing to the conversation, it really helps to start from books because you have a pattern recognition system for a brain, and for it to work at its best, it needs the most information, you got to give it the most stuff, and books are the best way to do that.
Have you read any notable books in the last 6 months?
Oh my god, I don't have it right behind me. I was going to grab it. My favorite. I've read a novel that was one of the best novels I've ever read in my life. How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu is one. It's brilliant. First of all, I've never read anything like it. Like, it's surprising, it's fun, it's shocking. You're like, oh my god, I can't believe somebody pulled this off. And then it's the greatest meditation on sort of like time and life and regret and why we should sort of like how it's just brilliant. He did an amazing job with it. I've read some other great books, but that's the one I was like, it's to me, it's the book of the year. You know what I mean? It's every once a year you read something, you're like, oh my God, how did you even do this? This is a miracle. It's not just a book. This is a miracle. That was this year's miracle.
Awesome. I'll add it to my list and we'll link it up in the show notes. And Stephen, before I let you go, just to come full circle, we were talking about your health crisis, your Lyme, and obviously you seem like you're in a much better place now. Talk about how that all panned out and where you're at today with your health.
Oh, I'm a beast. I ski with professional athletes every weekend. That's what, you know what I mean? Like, I fully, that's, I'll tell you this, a couple different times in my life, I was told I was never going to walk again at one point. I was told I was, never going to get out of bed with Lyme. I don't accept the diagnosis is my only advice on that one. Um, yeah, my health is great. But it took a while, right? Like, I say surfing got me to 80%. Getting back to 100% was a lot slower than I thought. It was really, you know what I mean? Like, that one took sort of 10, 12 years to figure out.
And was that mostly living the foundation that you talked about earlier, the gratitude, the meditation, and eating healthy?
I've been doing all that. I've been meditating since, uh, Jesus, I was 19 years old. I've been meditating for 30 years. I've been doing yoga for 25 years. I've been doing Ashtanga yoga. I was I was doing this stuff a long time ago, and I haven't stopped. What really changed is, an active recovery protocol. I bought an infrared sauna, and that, and really, really, really made sleep non-negotiable. Those are the biggest things. There was some other stuff too, doubling down on my primary flow activity. I went from skiing, which is 20 times a year, to skiing 50 times a year. That matters a lot too, for health. Anyways, but my health is great. Thanks for asking.
Good. Happy to hear. And other than listeners getting a copy of The Art of Impossible, how can they connect with you after the show?
StephenKotler.com is, if you've got questions about me, flowresearchcollective.com. You want to go farther with flow or flow training. And the website is theartofimpossible.com. And the last thing is, if you actually want to talk to me, Twitter is where of all the social media platforms, I found that people who have to write for a living communicate most on Twitter, because it's a limited thing. I cannot write an essay. If you let me write an essay, I'll write an essay, and then I won't be there. So if you actually want to ask me a question, Twitter is usually the best place to get me.
Perfect. Gonna link it all up in the show notes. And before I let you go, any final thoughts?
The last thing I just want to summarize is, look, I spent 30 years literally studying those moments in time when impossible became possible in every domain imaginable. And if I could sum up the lessons of 30 years in a couple of things, it's one, we are all hardwired for the extraordinary. Truly, we are all hardwired for the extraordinary. More importantly, most people don't know that, because human potential is invisible, especially to ourselves. We only figure out what we're capable of, one, by properly sort of applying our biology, but two, by stretching our skills to the utmost again and again and again. This stuff works like compound interest, and you got to push as hard as you can today, as hard as you can tomorrow. And that's how it starts to come together. But when you start doing it, you won't believe where you can end up.
All right. Great place to end. Thank you, Stephen. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it.